Hello and welcome to this webinar hosted by the Asia Society Policy Institute's Center for China Analysis, or CCA. I'm Neil Thomas. I'm a fellow at CCA, and I'll be leading our conversation today on tech, targets, and tensions, decoding Xi's priorities for China's next five-year plan. Thank you for joining us for what promises to be a fascinating discussion. Just to set the scene, last week from October 20th to 23rd, the Communist Party's Central Committee held its fourth plenum, or its fourth plenary meeting since the 20th Party Congress in 2022. The meeting was convened to discuss the party's proposals or recommendations for the next five-year plan for China's economic and social development, which is the 15th plan since China started making them in 1953. And it's going to go from 2026 to 2030, so shaping China's economy and the global economy for the next half decade. And we got a brief communique published last Thursday that summarized the political and policy outcomes of that plenum, the most important event of the year for China's domestic politics. But it was only yesterday that we got the full recommendations released by the party ahead of the five-year plan being drafted and released in full at next year's two sessions in early March 2026. But this document, these recommendations, set the overall targets and priorities of that plan and are going to be the basis of a lot of our discussion today. We also got an explanation of those recommendations from Xi himself, a speech he gave on the opening day of the plenum to his fellow cadres on the Central Committee to go into his reasoning. So some important context there. There were also a lot of political developments. We got announcements of several purges, a few promotions, as well as some very interesting data on the attendance of the plenum, which we'll get into later. But these documents are fresh. They've just come out, so looking forward to getting some rapid and expert reactions to those today. And I'm thrilled that we're going to be doing this with a really fantastic lineup. Got an incredible panel of speakers for this discussion. Firstly, Michael Hirson, is a CCA honorary fellow and the senior managing director and head of China at 22V Research, which is a macro investment firm, advisory firm in New York. He's previously the practice head for China at Eurasia Group and was the US Treasury Department's representative in China. So also got Christopher Johnson, who's a non-resident senior fellow on Chinese politics at CCA and the president and CEO of China Strategies Group, a political risk consulting firm. And he previously spent 2 decades in the US government's intelligence and foreign affairs communities. Dan Wang is the current China director for Eurasia Group. She was previously chief economist at Hang Seng China and was a senior analyst for the Economist Intelligence Unit in Beijing. And last but not least, Guoguang Wu is a CCA senior fellow on Chinese politics as well, and a senior research scholar at Stanford University. He's one of the leading scholars of Chinese elite politics and was a former aide to Chinese Premier Zhao Ziyang in the 1980s. Now, the way the conversation is going to work today is that we'll start with some discussion between myself and the speakers, and then we will get into Q&A. You should be able to see, if you're in the audience, a Q&A function in your Zoom window, so please feel free to ask a question at any time, and if it's relevant, we'll incorporate it into the discussion before the end of the session. So without much further ado, let's dive into it. We'll start with some of the kind of policy outcomes of the plenum and what it says about the five-year plan, given we just have that document dump from Beijing yesterday. So maybe, Dan, if we start with you, scene-setting question, from what the fourth plenum told us what are the key themes going to be of the 15th five-year plan that's released next year? And what, if anything, is different compared to the last five-year plan? Like, how has this plenum changed how we should think about China's economic policy and its kind of economic prospects going forward?
Hello, Neil. It's my great honor to be here. So when we look at this latest plan for China's next 5 year, there is some exciting change. I know for my friends in politics and geopolitics, this whole document looked quite dire. It covers everything. But from the econ perspective, I just can see there's a clear shift when it comes to the focus of the economy. One is that at the core of this high quality development, it's about building this modern industrial system, and it's all about the real economy. So previously, the government talked about developing services, city services especially, and a consumer market. But in this whole document, it's centering around real economy. Even it's about services, it's service industry serving the industries, serving the secondary industry, the heavy industries. So that is one thing. And the second thing I've noticed is this stress on technology self-sufficiency and original innovation. So previously, when we think about high quality growth in China, it's about this economic transition, commitment to tech investment, the application of all kinds of technology. But this is actually the first time that China has made it very clear it wants to seize this commanding heights in a lot of the technological fields, especially when it comes to basic research. So it wants to take the lead in more fields, more breakthroughs in core technology, especially the AI application, the AI innovation. And these are quite key when it comes to the China-US competition. So for me, this is more like a spirit going back to the 1950s. It is funny that you mentioned China started its 5-year plan from the 1950s. That was when China first laid a foundation for its heavy industry at the cost of rural China and the average living quality of Chinese people. I'm not saying that this time we're going to jeopardize another generation or even 2 generations of Chinese people to reach this target of technological advancement, but there's a very high chance that in the next 5 years, whoever lives in China will find it very uncomfortable to seek high income or to find a easy job. Because in this war between China and the US, there is really no room to fall back. When I talk to Chinese officials and Chinese regulators, the overwhelming sentiment is that China has to win this war. And it has prepared all kinds of resources and policy commitment in the next 5 years. It's a high cost, but the government is ready and it seems to have enough populist support to reach that goal.
Thanks, Dan. Sounds like a more continuity than change to me from that response that you gave. I mean, we've had a kind of campaign of US pressure on China's economy since at least the first Trump administration, a shift from economic engagement to strategic competition as the main theme there. So I guess I want to kind of follow up with, like, do you see that anything kind of new coming from this plan? Is it just an even greater focus on these goals to kind of seize the commanding heights, as you said, of innovation, manufacturing? And is this all about the United States? Has this changed because of Trump's election recently? Kind of what's the really new parts about this plan, if anything, or is this just business as we've seen for the last 5 years?
So in terms of the China-US background, it hasn't changed. The threat from the US is this continuous theme for China's 14th five-year plan, 15th. I'm sure after that, another decade is still in the big background. But I do get a sense that the approach that Chinese government is looking at technology is very different. Previously, it's more of a passive role. But because of all those developments in the past 5 years with the US, especially since the Liberation Day tariff, the kind of tit for tat, we see a more assertive China actually when it comes to the rare earth export control, when it comes to how to fight back in the tech export control. So the focus on indigenous innovation and basic research is quite new to me. And another sort of new approach is how to achieve that goal and how to build that talent pool. So we've seen different narrative around this high level opening up. And one aspect is to attract high technology talent immigration. So it's related with a K visa, and that's very different from before as well. So it's not just China can produce all the talents they need. It would learn from the US, learn from the Europe, and try to win over the global talents in this competition.
Neil, can I just jump in there? I think one quick point on the U.S.-China, to Dan's fine points, I think the interesting and maybe challenging part for the Chinese down the road is it seems like President Trump, and I'm sure we'll get into this more later, is about to at least soften the competition element. So, what does Xi Jinping do if the United States suddenly isn't pressing so hard? He loses somewhat of a justification to put the country through these challenges that Dan was describing. I think the other thing that's interesting, I haven't read much about it in any of the documents that have come out, but it was my thought that in the last 3 or 4 months, we've seen the government, after not really talking about the international circulation side of dual circulation much over the last year and a half, they've been so focused on the domestic circulation piece. Now all of a sudden we see some stronger emphasis on that again. And I would expect to see that in the plan. And I think that's very compatible with the technology drive, right? In the sense that they want to further embed global supply chains in those key areas, advanced technology in particular, deeper into China. And that's the international circulation piece of dual circulation.
Absolutely. I think that's a great point, right? Even if there is a softening of US-China competition in the moment, I think the long-term judgment in Beijing is that the external environment, the US attitudes towards China, and especially in the DC kind of foreign policy establishment, are trending downwards, and that vigilance is needed to ensure that if there's a change again, whoever the next US president is, for example, that China is prepared and China has the resilience to be able to withstand that. So I think that does suggest that this focus, this top priority on innovation, on supply chain dominance is going to continue and only deepen.
I think it's important too that we not confuse the tactical with the strategic in some of the responses. I agree with Dan that the Chinese are being, much more sort of forward-leaning and quick in their response this round. My own view is that sort of a tactical lesson Xi Jinping learned from the first trade war. It has strategic components to it, but my sense is he learned certain lessons then. One was not to give too much support to Trump in terms of going to the United States or going to Mar-a-Lago or these sort of issues. And similarly, I think they learned don't pause hoping things are going to get better through negotiation, punch back fast to let them know that you're serious.
Exactly. I mean, as she keeps on saying, the main thing is to firstly focus on ourselves and do a good job of making sure China's economy is strong and resilient. I want to bring Michael in here, and just to kind of follow up on this question about what is new about what we've learned about the Chinese economy, about the next 5-year plan. What are the key themes going to be going forward, and any changes that you've detected?
Well, I think Dan said it well. I mean, Xi, in his explanation, was quite explicit that this is continuity with the 14th 5-year plan. I would say continuity and consolidation. The consolidation comes in the form of trying to shore up some of the weak points that, where Xi feels perhaps that the economy is still not resilient enough in this period of major power competition, which the 5-year plan which the proposal also discussed quite explicitly. So I think, as Dan said, it's really striking how the extent to which this complete modern industrial system is the priority and tech self-reliance. And those are very those are very intertwined. It's about tech self-reliance, but very much integrated into industry and providing the kind of deterrence that Beijing has demonstrated with the rare earth controls recently. I think the big question for a lot of us, well, it's probably two, is one is what to make of consumption, which is an elevated priority. And, you know, I think you could, if you wanted to make an optimistic case, you could say that Beijing is starting to realize that this is also part of economic resilience, is you need the demand side. You can't just have a supply side. If the demand is not there domestically, you're left with a weak economy as you enter this period of trade tension with the US and others. So I think that's positive. That said, you know, I still think fair to say the jury is still out on how strong this consumption push is going to be. I don't think we saw you know, much in the way to suggest that Beijing is going to be doing a lot through the fiscal system in terms of income redistribution. And I think, you know, that leaves a fair amount of room for us to conclude that this is going to be quite a gradual policy shift. I think Dan made a great point on services, that even in the service section, it's about meeting the needs of industry and the real economy. And, you know, the service sector is really important because, especially in a time when the job market in China has been very weak, kind of structurally weak, labor-intensive services are a really important part of that shift towards consumption. But, you know, I think the service sector is likely to, you know, to continue to be second fiddle very much to industry. And then the other question is where does involution, excess capacity fit into all of this? I didn't see really any explicit mention of this in the proposal draft. Now, she did mention this again specifically about how new quality productive forces, this drive for, you know, industrial upgrading and tech self-reliance, has to meet with local conditions. And certain provinces have endowments. That doesn't mean everyone should rush into the same sector. But I think I think it's going to be a very difficult balance, right? Because local officials are still going to have very strong incentives to frame their investment and other activities in terms of new quality productive forces. As Dan said, that is the mantra. Like, that's the number one goal that's been set down. So, you know, I think if we think about involution and the related areas of excess capacity and deflation, Beijing still is treating this very much as a behavioral issue, trying to discipline local governments politically, discipline firms. It's not really treating this as a macroeconomic problem, which is where you'd really want to see pretty strong measures to boost domestic demand, probably more aggressively than what's signaled thus far, and also to really change the underlying incentive. So bottom line, I think, given the importance of the modern industrial system and tech self-reliance drive, these other factors of, you know, consumption and involution, I think, are going to seem likely to remain quite incremental and gradual in terms of the actual policy shift here, despite the rising rhetorical importance in the 5-year plan.
Yeah, lots of interesting threads there. And let's maybe drill down on those kind of twin issues of overcapacity or high capacity, depending on how you want to define it, and involution, because, you know, they're linked, right? Like, overproduction is what is driving down prices and profits and tax revenues. It's kind of involutionary spiral where companies, even at the cutting edge of various new tech fields, EVs in particular, just, you know, can't make money and aren't really contributing to the tax base or to, you know, R&D spending as much as they could be. And, you know, that goes hand in hand with the concerns of many developed economies, especially, or even emerging economies, trying to build their manufacturing sectors, that they're going to be swamped by cheap Chinese imports at increasingly higher value-added points in the manufacturing ecosystem. Europe, Brazil, like Russia has put tariffs on imports of Chinese electric vehicles in recent months. So, I mean, maybe just to throw this question to anyone who wants to jump in, Dan, Chris, or Guoguang, I mean, what's your outlook for that question of overcapacity involution? Did it mean anything that Xi Jinping held a, you know, central financial and economic affairs commission meeting about, you know, overcapacity involution, building a unified national market in July. That's one of the most important economic commissions. There's a lot of feeling that, oh, this is a new step in tackling these issues. China's going to take this seriously now. It's got Xi's stamp of approval. But again, we're seeing like there's a lot of different priorities that he has. And as we've heard, this tech self-reliance drive still seems central to the upcoming 5-year plan. Chris, if you want to jump in.
I will, but I obviously defer to Michael and Dan's greater wisdom on this one. But I think, what's interesting to me is it is this duality, isn't it? On the one hand, we're getting unambiguous signals that the highest levels of leadership are caring about the issue, right? We had that, as you said, we had Xi Jinping's comments at the Central Urban Work Conference earlier, and also the later released commentary about how it's disorderly and price competition, these sort of things, right? So when the top leader makes those kind of comments, the system gets serious about things. That's true. But fundamentally, I think we're still in the space where, as Michael was just pointing out, until they're ready to take the steps that would need to be taken, which is to change the incentive structure for local government officials that currently drives them to wanting to have their own champion, right? And each industry that is favored by Beijing, then there's not going to be any change, right? Those local officials, the view is very simple. You took away my property revenue. I need revenue. I need growth for my KPIs. I need tax revenue. I need jobs for my cousins and friends and children. So until that changes, and that would require pretty substantial fiscal and tax reform, it's hard for me to see how they're going to get on top of it. I think there was some early enthusiasm that this might look a bit like 2015-16 supply side structural reform, but of course the issues at hand are very different. At that time it was upstream things like concrete and coal and so on. We were dealing with state-owned enterprises for the most part, which made it easier for Beijing to make changes by fiat, right? This time we're looking at the downstream consumer-led stuff. It's private companies for the most part. And it's not like, we saw certainly in the crackdown on tech and other private sector companies a few years ago, it's not like the leadership can't crack down on them, but it is more difficult for them to get a hold of them than, say, state-owned enterprises.
So for this anti-evolution, there is one sentence mentioned in the 14th 5-year plan agenda, and it's in the section of building this unified domestic market. So the core of it is both the industrial policy and the social policy, and that's clear. But the core of it is not about cutting capacity. It is about preventing this hostile price competition, especially when it links to the regional competition between different markets in China. For example, if you are living in Chongqing, the Chongqing government will prioritize the government procurement of local cars first because it has local brands. And when you go to Guangdong would only use BYD. So every section in China has its own brand to protect. That's one aspect. It's impossible, practically impossible to politically cut capacity in that area. But then the second point, which I find is actually more alarming, is that the precise China model to focus so much on tech is in itself deflationary. So by investing more in technology, it's just making the whole system way more efficient than before. So it can produce more things at higher quality and better, faster. So the overcapacity export, if we call that overcapacity, is just a lot of capacity that cannot be absorbed within this boundary of the market. It has to go somewhere else. And the fact that Chinese companies are trying so hard to go global is sort of pushed by this idea that they cannot make profit at home. You can only make a profit in an inflationary environment. You cannot make a profit at a deflationary environment. So they all get out. And once they get out, they would set up a factory somewhere and then import machinery, raw material, industrial inputs, all kinds of things, even talents and technology from China. So this spillover from China will be long-term. I would call that permanent deflation and permanent spillover from China's production capacity. It's not something that Chinese government can address with a tax reform or other type of labor market structural reform. It will only be curbed, or a new equilibrium will only happen when other markets develop similar or comparable capacity to counter China. But I just don't see much possibility in that.
Yeah, I think I think that's a great way of putting it. If you were worried about the China shock, in terms of coming for more companies at the higher ends of the value chain, I think you've got to be that much more concerned now. All of the factors leading to this, the intense, effort to climb the value chain, and control the supply chain, coupled with a weak domestic market in terms of profit margins. Yeah, this is, I think I absolutely agree. This should be terrifying to Germany, South Korea, Japan, some industries in the US, and of course, even some developing countries as well.
I think that's what's really striking, right, is the draft document's emphasis on the traditional manufacturing enterprises as well, and upgrading those with advanced technologies and so on and so forth. So it's not just the high end production, it's the low end or low to medium end as well. So that's very disruptive for, some of their key targets for exports, the Global South, other Asian countries and so on.
Yeah, I think that's an important kind of takeaway for governments around the world, right, as well as industries and private firms and manufacturing in those countries. And it looks like whatever's happening in South Korea right now, that there's underlying tensions in China's economic relationships with the developed world are only going to be exacerbated.
Maybe while we wait, Dan, did you have any, I think I can anticipate your response, but anything on the consumption agenda strike you as new, or do you see it mostly as more of the same?
So for consumption, that's a funny thing, because based on my understanding of the system, the Chinese government were never willing or could stimulate consumption, and they know that. So the market and businesses keep anticipating China and Chinese government to prioritize consumption. There are trading programs, there are subsidies, but it's always capped. It's never the main driver. It's never the main receiver for fiscal outlays. And also, when we think about consumption, we're comparing consumption now versus consumption bundle in 2019. Back then, there was housing. So when an average Chinese family buy a new apartment, of course, automatically they will buy big items like aircon, maybe a car, or they can spend $500,000 easily on housing decoration. So in that bundle of the consumer basket, more than half of the items are related with home purchase. But now when we think about Chinese consumer basket, there's no home and there's no item related with housing. So that's automatically already half of the previous bundle gone. But if we look at the remainder of the half, so there are a lot more services, entertainment, cultural spending. So it's actually improved the bundle. But because of this depressed consumer confidence, so we don't see the kind of increase of consumption, like momentum as before. And I just don't think that the government is going to stimulate consumption in any big way. It has come out with some of the marginal improvement, like the subsidies to families with children. And PBOC just recently announced this really indirect way of this one-time cut for the debt people had during COVID, but if they paid later, it's just a one-time rollover. So this kind of marginal improvement is not really prioritizing consumption anyway.
Apologies for dropping out of that call for some very unknown technical difficulties, but right back in. I think you kind of started addressing the thread that I was trying to pull, which is if China keeps on this investment, manufacturing, focused growth model, like what are the longer term implications for China's economic trajectory? Is China going to be able to meet its kind of soft target for 4.5% growth going forward? Like, is it even important that China is not prioritizing consumption, which is what a lot of economists around the world, including some in China, are constantly calling for? Like, why is this? Is this a problem for China domestically, even if it might be a problem for policymakers in DC and Brussels? What's the longer term implications? Is productivity going to solve all of China's economic problems, which seems to be China's Xi Jinping's kind of big bet on innovation. He's all about total factor productivity improvements in the next 5-year plan, which sounds wonderful. But is this growth model going to do that? And yeah, basically, is it going to work? And why are economists criticizing it from an economic point of view? Are they right? So maybe Dan or Michael, if you want to start off the thread there.
So I'll take it first. This model is highly risky because at this point, if you look at the contribution to GDP, it's actually net export. So China has a historical high trade surplus. Despite of all those tariff threats, China's export has been beating expectations almost every single month since 2020. So there is a consistent underestimation on how strong the supply chain and how strong the overseas demand is. And I think this momentum is actually going to last if nothing drastic that would derail this trend. I'm talking about if China is thinking about something, that really unexpected, but if we're staying on this course, given the current macroeconomic condition, it can last. But then if we're thinking about whether China can stay on the course of growing about 5% a year, because that's the implicit target in this 15th five-year plan, China still has the 2035 target of becoming the mid-high income level economy. And that means the economy has to grow, depending on how you make assumptions about the currency, between 4.6% to 5%. And that's very high. But because it's real GDP growth, it will be nominal growth minus inflation, because China now has deflation, right? So even if it has 3% of nominal growth, automatically you already have about 5% of real growth because of deflation. And the net export alone can contribute about 3 percentage points of the growth. So I don't think that technically it cannot be done. It is just that this model is at the cost of the social welfare. It's at the cost of income growth. So if we look at the family income growth, it has been stalling in the past 3 years, regardless of what the official stats are saying. If you look at the individual industry's wage income, it has been declining for the most part in the past 3 years.
I don't have much to add. I think that captures it really well. You could get there with, in real terms, in terms of real growth. But, I think nominal growth is going to stay much weaker and is probably a better barometer for where the actual economy is. I think with new quality productive forces and total factor productivity, the way that I phrase this for the last 5-year plan was that his recipe for productivity gains is basically digitization, not liberalization. And I think to some extent you could still make it, looks a little bit different, but it's a similar dynamic. And what I mean there basically is it's about directing resources to improve innovation, to improve productivity, but that is important and in many respects will be successful. What it ignores is essentially like the distortions in the economy, a lot of which come from the state system, which are a pretty significant drag on productivity growth. If you look at studies by the IMF and others, not that they're the only arbiters of this, but I think domestically economists would agree as well that, the large role for SOEs, the barriers in the service sector that restrict it to the state-owned firms, a lot of these are pretty big drag on productivity. So it's going to be hard to have a true surge in productivity growth just through industrial policy and innovation policy.
So in some ways, Xi's efforts to boost productivity are hampering productivity.
Or there's a trade-off. There is a significant trade-off. You've got, you'll get there. You'll build, the world-class firms. You'll build a BYD, but you're going to be throwing a lot of capital after a lot of, second run EV firms in the quest to groom that next BYD.
And yeah, I feel like a big theme of the policy discourse in Beijing at the moment is how do we do for all of the emerging industries what we've done for EVs, for solar panels, for lithium batteries, and becoming the dominant, key, indispensable player in global supply chains. And that was achieved through the existing set of industrial policies. And so trying to address involution and consumption whilst also, doubling down on this supply chain dominance goal is a set of contradictions that will be difficult to resolve. But there are a few questions actually on this set of related issues in the Q&A that maybe we can get some quick thoughts on, particularly questions around whether Xi's tech drive or kind of the broad orientation of policy at the moment is becoming more favorable for private firms and entrepreneurs in China. We had that kind of remarkable meeting in February where she reconciled publicly with Jack Ma after banning the Ant Group IPO in 2020 and surrounded himself with some of the richest and most successful titans of China's tech industry. So there was some optimism that developed there about kind of returning to a more business-friendly policy setting. And so that's the basic thrust of the question from an anonymous audience member. So I'd be curious to get people's reactions there. Like, how is the environment for private entrepreneurs changing? Is it changing? And what should we expect for how the private sector plays into the 5-year plan? Maybe Chris, if you have any thoughts on that, and can open it up to others afterwards.
Yeah, I think just quickly and welcome others' comments. My sense is it's hard for the private sector to not feel a bit better after what they endured 3 or 4 years ago. But my impression when I'm in China speaking to those folks, investment is still largely staying on the sidelines. They do feel better about the general picture, but they're well aware that the wind could shift again, very rapidly. And so that's one important sentiment. I think the other is sort of, do you want to make the sort of deal with the devil, especially in the tech space, that is being proposed? In other words, folks are being approached by the Central Science and Technology Commission in very sort of sub rosa ways, saying this is what we need. We'll give you all the money that you could ever want, but you got to abide by the following terms, and I think that's challenging for entrepreneurial types to agree to. And also, as Dan was saying in her introductory remarks, you also have to be willing to buy into the real economy, right? So in other words, don't give us any of that services stuff, which is, of course, the way that private entrepreneurs rapidly generate value and wealth. We want, things that are practical. So I think it's a very mixed bag on private sector sentiment, but Michael and Dan probably know more.
I also want to bring in Guoguang to this question, because obviously it goes to the relationship between different political actors in China's system, given how policy is politics everywhere, but especially so in Beijing. So Guoguang, I'm curious as to your thoughts about the party's attitudes towards entrepreneurs, and are they changing? Is this a recalibration of the relationship between development and security that's going on? Curious as to your reactions.
Go ahead, Guoguang.
Yes. Actually, I don't see any new ideas from the document regarding the private sector. It repeats a lot of things it already said previously. Basically, I think the spirit, in the party's language. So the spirit continues from the last conference between Xi Jinping and those private entrepreneurs. So no really, substantial policies suggested this time.
I would just add that, look at the are not appearing in this film, most of the time, which is the Central Social Work Department and its mandate to penetrate the private sector, right, on behalf of the party. And that gives you, I think, some sort of sense as to the party's attitudes towards the sector.
My own sort of like spin on the Jack Ma, just my own personal theory, reconciliation. I think, yes, there's a recognition of some overreach here, certainly on the part of the leadership. I think it does seem as though, she has provided a bit more room for others in the cabinet, the premier and others to oversee economic policy, not the big decisions, but, on the margin. But I think also, to me, it seems the backdrop behind that reconciliation in that meeting is also, I think a lot of it is about AI. I think with the last 5-year plan, there was this very clear shift from kind of soft tech to hard tech, right? It was a sense that the e-commerce firms were not delivering the goods and were being very disruptive to some sectors that she cared about and were challenging the party's regulatory authority. Well, now in the age of, LLMs and generative AI, these firms are suddenly very important again. And they also have gotten the message that they need to also be behind the push in areas like semiconductors. So I think that's, part of this is there's got to be a pivot back to the software companies, or at least the companies with expertise in AI. And so that to me is kind of part of the picture of what's also behind this pivot, is a recognition again that now these firms are back to a level where they're strategically important.
I will only add a small point on the private sector. So if you are a big private player that are in the business aligned with the national strategy, then you're having a great time in China. But this is not a market for small players anymore. Micro firms cannot survive. It has long been the case that small companies cannot borrow in the market. And if they don't have a collateral, they practically cannot borrow from the bank. And the only collateral for most of them are housing. And housing are now losing value for consecutive 4 years. So basically no one can borrow from the bank. And now when we look at the performance of the private sector in China, the profitability has improved, but it's only because smaller ones are dead. So for the bigger ones, we're thinking about a Kettle, BYD, and all the other cutting edge technology IT company, then they're doing well. But it doesn't mean the general job market for this sector is improving.
And Dan, you also touched on another kind of key issue in the Chinese economy, which is the property sector, and house prices have been falling. That's where a lot of people have their, most of their wealth. I mean, did we see anything interesting on the property sector on addressing these real estate concerns and kind of recovering this asset market for consumers, households, local governments in the plenum in terms of signaling about the next 5-year plan? Like, what's the Chinese government trying to do about this, and is it going to work?
So in my previous job, the whole focus was on the property market, but now it's safe to say that the housing market is gone in China. And in this particular 15th 5-year plan agenda, the mention of the housing market is not in the section of industry. It's in the section of social welfare and common prosperity. So it has been reduced to this role of supporting the welfare of the people. So it has a few implications. The most important one is basically the government is not going to bail out this sector. The economic downturn driven by this housing downturn will continue. Right now, China is in its 5th year, almost 5th year of the housing downturn. It's starting to look more and more like Japan. And I wouldn't be surprised if it lasts all the way to 2035. But it's not a top concern for the government. It's no longer a driver for the economy. And alternatively, it has the high-tech investment, although that doesn't generate the jobs for low-skilled workers or migrant workers, or for the most part, fresh graduates. But that is the policy priority. It is about a transformative technology in the future. It's definitely not housing.
Thanks, Dan. And I think that's important context for people who've been following this sector for many decades. I mean, was a deliberate move by Beijing to try and rein in the property developers with the 3 red lines policy in 2020 didn't quite have the effects that they were anticipating in terms of how severe it was, but still, like, this is something that's part of what she wants to do rather than a surprise in total part to the Chinese government. I think given time constraints, we might kind of move the discussion on to the politics and kind of US-China dimensions of the fourth plenum. But perhaps before we do, we can just do a quick lightning round on the policy outcomes. Just curious if everyone has any quick thoughts on what didn't we discuss that you thought was especially important about the fourth plenum, or what's ahead for the 5-year plan, or perhaps something that you want to see or that should happen that didn't. Just a quick kind of lightning round. So maybe we'll start with Guoguang and then go to Chris, Michael, and Dan.
Okay, that's really, as Neil mentioned in email, that's really a record purge, particularly with the announcement of 9 generals purged on the eve of the plenum. So we really don't know what happened in Beijing, in Zhongnanhai, but something unusual. So basically, I think there are 3 features of this wave of purges. First, the scope is really, really big. So not only those announced purges, but also a lot of people, of Central Committee members, they were absent from the plenum. So totally, I think, confirmed purged guys and members of the Central Committee. Only 3 years actually passed after they were appointed to the Central Committee. 30 people were purged. So taking 8%. And this percentage is much higher than those guys purged from the Central Committee during the first 3 years of the 18th Central Committee. So the 18th Central Committee actively was the most purged, organization before this wave. Actively, those 5 years, Xi Jinping's first 5 years, marked a really high tide of purges. So why after 10 years the situation is even worse for Xi Jinping? He had to do purges like that. Also, I would say the PLA, of course, everybody says that the PLA is a focus of purges. That's his major power base. That's why so many rumors spreading to talk about his powers problem, maybe toppled by some others. The third one, of course, I think everybody would agree that the purge is still going on, including within the military, and is not finished yet. So we don't know how many generals will be purged in next 2 years. So basically, why we don't know. I have my guesses. So basically, a lot of factors, maybe, but I think sub-Xi factional, rivalry is really important factor contributing to this purge, this wave of purges. So particularly within the military, actively. So why sub-Xi factional struggles intensify? I think that's due to several factors. First of all, I would say, his military reform actually causes a lot of chaos within the military, and also discontent from generals, and also makes actively factional connections within the military more complicated than before. So that's one, I would say, problem. And also without norms of appointing commanders. And Xi Jinping, for example, retained Zhang Youxia within the as the highest ranking military guy, and within the Politburo. And Zhang Youxia is already 75 years old. So actively, that means a lot of younger people, now they were not able to get the position as they had expected, So like Miaohua, for example. So I think, sub-factional competition between Zhang Youxia's guys and Miaohua's guys, might explain, the last 2 years purchase of generals from Li Xiangfu to the current group. Actively, corruption, is still, everywhere. I mean, there's still rampant corruption. So when you have such kind of factional competition, easy for you to find, corruption of your rivals, and when you present this kind of evidence to desk of Xi Jinping, I think Xi Jinping has to do purchase. The third factor, that might contribute to the intensification of sub-Xi factional competition, particularly within the military and also generally within the CCP. I guess, last summer, summer 2024, it seemed that Xi Jinping's health condition were really, there were some problems. I don't know what problems there were, but there were actively indicators saying that there could be a critical moment for Xi Jinping's health, and everybody felt that. So Xi Jinping, yes, he will stay in power maybe forever, but the problem is nature's a limit. Okay, nature's actively ceiling. So then they have to prepare for the future after Xi Jinping. I think so that's really black box. So it's just my guesses.
Thanks, Guoguang. And that's a good pivot into the political dimensions of this fourth plenum, which really kind of lived up to the name that some people dubbed it on social media, the Purge Plenum. We had a record low attendance, as you hinted at. Only 315 of the original 376 members and alternates to the Central Committee were there. That's the lowest kind of proportion of Central Committee members at a plenum in the post-Mao era. It's only about like 83.8%. I crunched the numbers a few days ago, and it certainly suggests that there are more disappearances to be confirmed, more purges coming, even beyond the rumors that were circulating ahead of that plenum. And so that's an interesting thing to observe, but it just goes to this broader anti-corruption and political discipline campaign that Xi launched, almost on day one of his leadership, and which has really intensified since he got his third term in 2022. So let's continue on this train of thought. I want to turn kind of the same set of issues over to you, Chris. And what do you make of this? What's going on here, and why is Xi purging so many people right now, both in the military, which gets a lot of attention, but also on the civilian side of things? More and more members and alternates, previously prominent people like Liu Jianchao, the former head of the International Department, have disappeared from view. The former head of the Ministry of Industry and Information Technology also hasn't been seen for several months. What's your...
Yeah. No, obviously there's a lot of people missing, and one wonders, when the Central Committee members who were allowed to attend arrive, do they look to their left or right and say, where's my friend Mr. Joe, or something? In other words, how aware are they of what's happening? Probably not that aware until such moments, which I think Xi Jinping finds delicious, right? And furthers his goals and his signature of constantly keeping the plates spinning and people off balance. That is the signature of his political style. I think, in terms of what did or didn't happen, to me, the results of the plenum, given all that was on the table, as you suggested, are quite static, right? In other words, we know there's on this, let's start on the civilian side, even at the Politburo level, there's things ranging from weird to unresolved, right? So weird being the shift in April of two Politburo members swapping portfolios, Shi Taifeng and Li Ganjie, right? That is strange. It's hard to know what the reasoning behind it is. I think the general view, which probably is correct, is that, Li Ganjie just wasn't doing a great job, and things were happening within his own outfit, the organization department, very important, obviously, for party personnel, especially as we reach the half point in this central committee and move toward a next party Congress. And you've got, the head of the Discipline Inspection Commission inside the organization department being rung up for corruption. It's not a good look. We have, of course, the Shandong drinking party at the Lianghui rumors and, things like that. So, they seem to have settled into their new positions just fine. But, why did Xi Jinping feel he needed to make the move? And then obviously we have the former Xinjiang Party Secretary Ma Xingrui, right, who clearly has been removed from that job. Central media said he'd be given another. That has not been publicly announced yet. My understanding is he does have a new job, but it's a mystery, right, as to what was happening there. And none of that stuff was addressed, obviously, at the plenum. More directly, coming to the military, you had a situation where of those 9 generals that Guoguang referred to days before the plenum opened, you had a Politburo member, 2 members of the CMC, and 8 Central Committee members. So, that was a lot of room, if you will, to do that housekeeping at the plenum. And really all they did was remove the Central Committee members, give Jiang Chenmin, the former, current still Discipline Inspection Commission head inside the military, a promotion, but not to the Politburo, right? Didn't fill the vacant Politburo seat. So it all looks quite static. And as you were saying, Neil, the message, I think, of the attendance numbers is there's a lot more coming, right? At least another dozen or 2 dozen Central Committee members certainly have to be moved along. In terms of what's behind it all from Xi Jinping, I think, I'm reluctant to assign it to factional intrigue in all cases. I think there's certainly some of that going on, but I think we have a mix of things. So on the civilian side with Liu Jianchao, for example, we don't know. There are allegations of, hand in the cookie jar kind of things, which, as Guoguang was pointing out, when you have enemies, that stuff can be found if it needs to be. I think you also have a situation where, whether consciously or unconsciously, he allowed himself to be touted, 2 years ago, as the next foreign minister on a tour of the United States and other countries, when clearly that wasn't Xi Jinping's idea of what he should be doing. And that probably wasn't very bright. So, you see these things come in. In the military, I think it's very important to draw a distinction between what's happened in the cases of, say, the former defense ministers, Li Shangfu and Wei Fenghe, and the rocket forces, which in my mind is just pure garden variety graft. I've been watching civil military relations in China for 30 years. If you want to know where the corruption is in the PLA, just look at what they're spending on. In the last few years, they've been spending on the missile forces. So, that's inevitable. Whereas if you look at the kind of loose charge sheet, if we want to call it that, on the purges of He Weidong and Miaohua, there's direct discussion of them violating the principle of the party controlling the gun and the CMC chairman responsibility system. So, that was not present in the similar charge sheets on Li Shangfu and Wei Fenghe. So clearly they were up to something that was more troubling, and it reminds me very much of the fall of Fang Fenghui and Zhang Yang just before the 19th Party Congress, if I remember correctly. Just days before, they looked like they were on a track to become CMC vice chairman. They were purged. So why? We don't really know, and we probably never will. One of the things that's difficult with Xi Jinping around is he's made the black box even blacker in a number of ways, more opaque, and also this air that he likes to cultivate of, sort of infallibility, unflappability, indefatigability, that he's not prone to, engage in sort of theatrical explanations of the Mao era of, the Lin Biao anti-party clique or something like that. Instead, just sweep it under the rug. And you look at the communique from the 4th plenum, we see that in effect, right? Blah, 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 blah. Oh, no, by the way, these guys are gone. And this guy is now vice chairman. Thank you very much. And don't ask any more questions. So, that's my sense. I also, just for the record, find the idea that, sort of Jiang Youxia was independently purging people and running street battles within the PLA to be not consistent with what we know about Xi Jinping's power.
Thanks, Chris. And yeah, I mean, as you mentioned, we just know so little about the backroom machinations. But I think the idea that Xi is emerging from this plenum with his power and his position very much intact is pretty unimpeachable in terms of what we do actually know about what's going on in Beijing. But I want to just stay on Guoguang and Chris for another moment to just put this fourth plenum in the broader political context, because, I mean, even more important than a plenum, way more important than a plenum in some ways, is the party congresses that happen every 5 years. And we're only 2 years away from the 21st Party Congress, which will be held in late 2027. We'll see a new Central Committee, new Politburo, new Standing Committee, the kind of half-decade turnover of the Chinese leadership. And so this plenum, the personnel movements in it, are very much happening in the context of the lead up to that party congress. And I think we're just going to get even more feverish speculation about what's going on behind the high walls of the Zhongnan leadership compound in that period. So just want to ask the kind of the bigger question about Chinese politics, first to you, Guoguang, and then to Chris. I mean, what should we expect in the lead up to that party congress, and where is it all going? Are we going to just get the same in Chinese politics afterwards? Are we going to see some kind of move towards Xi's succession? Are we going to maybe see something totally new in Chinese elite politics emerging? Just curious as to how does this fourth plenum make you think about what's going to happen at that next party congress? So Guoguang, I'll start with you.
Thank you, Neil. I would say we will see general change of membership, huge scale of general change of the members of the Central Committee 2 years later. So we will see some indicators who will be qualified to join the next Central Committee when later the next year, I mean late 2026 and early 2027, when provincial leadership finish its reshuffling and the new faces will emerge. Also within the military, I guess this is big challenge to Xi Jinping when he promoted Jiang Zemin. It seems that he prefers to stability of the leadership at this moment without adding new members to the Central Military Commission. So that means he is not really confident to those younger guys, and he doesn't know who will be trusted, who could be trusted. In civilian sphere, I think the situation could be a little bit better. So those guys who were born in the 1970s were recently quickly promoted. So according to the official timeline published before, not for this party congress, for the coming 21st party congress, but for the previous party congress. So after this plenum, by the end of this year, the central leadership will formally start the preparation, particularly in terms of personnel for the next party congress. Then in next year, spring, following the 2 sessions, so a leadership group charge of this will be set up, and Xi Jinping, of course, will be the head of the group. So he will pay a lot of attention to assessment of candidates, of delegates to the party congress, central committee members to the next organization. Particularly, I would say at least half of the incumbent central committee members will be replaced. So that means a large-scale replacement in 2027. So when I talk about general change of the central committee members, I don't expect a lot of, such kind of change taking place for the top leadership. It's hard to predict. So how the Politburo will be younger 2 years later, but I think Xi Jinping will stay. Yeah, maybe that's too bold to see to see that right now. But yeah, Xi Jinping would stay, but it seems that from a very recent practice of his, governing style, it seems that he would like to release a little bit more power to some others like Li Qiang in international relations, to some other guys, maybe in charge of other things. So I don't really foresee a formal two-line structure emerging at the next 20-party Congress. Two-line structure means just like during Deng Xiaoping years. So Deng Xiaoping didn't take any formal number one position, but he was the real boss. I don't think Xi Jinping would follow this track, but some substantial two-line structure of power could emerge. That means Xi Jinping still sees maybe all those number one positions of the party, the state, and the military, but in practice, he would give some more power to his subordinates. So if we see something new, that could be the number one new feature I would say for the next leadership. Succession, I don't think Xi Jinping would like to discuss that. So yeah, I think so.
Thanks, Guoguang. Over to you, Chris. What are your thoughts about the next party Congress and what this plenum says about, will it be a succession event? Would there be something different?
Yeah. It's hard to interpret much from the plenum, I think, on the broader succession issue. Other than that, as I mentioned earlier, to me, the theme of this plenum is unfinished business. And that business has to be conducted, at some point. Is that at the party Congress or is it before? We don't know. Well, I think we do know that, a lot of the people who currently are under investigation, it's a good reminder, right, that the party has its own procedures. Obviously, they can be sped up or slowed down as politically necessary, but, they do take their time, with these cases. We've had structurally, we have an interesting scenario, right, in the sense that typically, as we all know, there are 7 of these plenums in a typical 5-year Central Committee cycle. Xi Jinping, for reasons known only to him, decided to withhold the timing of the 3rd plenum from its typical slotting in sort of the year after a party Congress to 2 years after the party Congress. And so he kind of has this sort of spare plenum, if we want to call it that he could deploy anywhere between now and 2027. Maybe he will do so, to at least take care of that housekeeping, maybe make some of the other adjustments. I mean, I think when we look, the one thing that, as Guoguang was saying, the one thing that the 4th plenum does tell us about succession is that Xi Jinping is not ready to signal the military succession yet. And my guess is that's because, despite the fact that Zhang Youxia is 75 and will be 77 and arguably was retained beyond his original expiration date, at the 20th Party Congress, and even He Weidong was no spring chicken, right? He might have had to have stepped down by the traditional sort of measures at the 21st Party Congress. And yet it suggests to me, as we've been discussing, that, the situation within the military with regard to purges is still too hot, I guess we could call it, for him to be able to settle things down. And obviously the fact that he's left the political work department seat on the Central Military Commission open, despite the fact that, the PLA is the armed wing of the Communist Party, not the National Military of China. And therefore that political work department is a very important piece of the machinery. Just speaks volumes, right? In terms of other things, if he decides to do this spare plenum, maybe he would give some signaling. I wrote a piece about this a couple of weeks ago on the succession. My only point in it was to basically say we shouldn't get too trapped in the conventional wisdom of he wants to rule forever, and and he's not thinking at all about the succession. My guess is a guy who considers himself a deep thinker, right? Philosopher king in some respects, and what a deep student of not just Chinese imperial history, but Chinese Communist Party history, Soviet history. He has to understand that the succession has been a big problem in all those enterprises. And, perhaps is it a legacy thing for him to try to do a better job? I don't know, and I think it would be very difficult. What I do think is, obviously, as Guoguang was hinting at, we're going to have big changes in the Central Committee, big changes in the Politburo. And we're seeing, the typical provincial reassignments and movements, right, that we see at this time in a given central committee cycle that are starting to signal to us who the party's got its eye on, at least, and we'll see where things go from there. I mean, I think it's impossible to determine, whether she will signal the succession or not between now and the party Congress. It seems unlikely. But on the other hand, as Guoguang was hinting, he is, my personal view is I don't think there's solid evidence that he's had any major health problems. He's, according to some diaspora media and so on, seems to have a stroke every other week. But, he is over 70, overweight, was a heavy smoker for a good chunk of his life, and has a very stressful job. So, if you talk to any actuarialists, they'll tell you, it's possible. So, and that must be weighing on his mind. And that's
Thanks, Chris. I think that's a fantastic overview. I do want to just bring in Michael and Dan. I mean, economists working on China can't escape politics, so you're not getting off scot-free in this section. Just want to get your sense as people who study China's economy and its kind of policymaking very deeply. Like, is there a connection between what Xi is doing in elite politics and how his policy agenda is being implemented? Like, how do these purges and Xi's broader leadership style actually affect Chinese governance and maybe his ability to realize these fourth plenum goals? Or are these totally different sideshows? I don't know, Dan, if you want to take this first, and then we can go to Michael.
Okay, I can start. Here's what I can say. Since Xi took office, he has already changed the entire incentive system among Chinese bureaucrats. Previously, when we discussed Chinese economy, there was always this phrase hanging around, that's the mare economy, this regional tournament competition. So every province, every city is striving for new investment, new ideas, but that economy has died. And around 2020, it's no longer the case that officials are competing to get resources or to get ahead. They're trying to comply. And because they are held accountable for any decisions they make for life. And then when you look at how policies are implemented, it's always stalling. So of course, this new way of governing, so it's in my head, it's basically saying the party is more effective than the government. And the party has set up this new example of how to run this country. And all the officials try to get on board. And then they lost all incentive to do anything new. So when we look at the new regulatory framework, because the government is trying so hard to put a floor on all those risks, then they're taking too much responsibility for the economy. And that's why when we look at the economy, like aside from the emerging industries, there's an inactivity in private sector. It's very clear. But if you are in those sectors that's chosen by the party state, then it's overactivity. That's the fierce competition. That's the overcapacity we see. So you see this dichotomy, and I, as an economist, I always find it quite worrying. But it is, I don't have a better word. It is a miracle that how China has handled it with this kind of new incentive system, this kind of housing downturn. We haven't seen any signs of collapsing. So the state power is at its best behavior. So we actually see some sort of like new model information in the formation right now.
Yeah, I don't have much to add. I think that's right. And the other dynamic that we see time and again is, of course, the sort of frozen decision making, because there are conflicting mandates and it's not clear where the balance will lie there. I don't see anything to suggest that that's shifting anytime soon. I mean, you've got the modern industrial system, the tech self-reliance push. You've also got anti-involution. Those are not easy to reconcile. I really like the way that Dan put it, where you've got inactivity where there's any kind of uncertainty about whether you'll be judged, and then overactivity if you feel like you have a green light. Now, of course, the problem is those lights can change. But I think basically bottom line, I don't think any of these dynamics are new. They've been continued features as Dan said, since she took office, and certainly something that we've seen especially over the last 5 years or so, I don't notice any significant changes beyond perhaps what I said earlier, which is on the margin, some more room for the leadership below Xi to exercise more autonomy in day-to-day economic decision-making.
That, I think we see a dynamic that is even more pronounced than may have initially appeared, which is the stubbornness of Xi Jinping in certain areas. Like when he sets his stall out on a particular approach, it seems like it's very difficult to persuade him to look in another direction, unless a few things happen. He just decides to change course on his own, which does happen on occasion, or some event or series of data or whatever occurs, not necessarily a crisis or anything like that, that allows the people that Michael and Dan were just referring to go to him and ask him to have another look. But it's one of two things that the 5-year plan directional trajectory shows us. It's either he so fundamentally believes in this technology drive, as the answer, that he's willing to just shut out other thoughts, or it's just that, it's very, very difficult for these people to say to him, can we try to walk and chew gum at the same time? In other words, yes, pursue the technological superdrome, but at the same time, we've got to do something about deflation. We've got to do something about domestic demand. We've got to do something about consumer. And, what's interesting to me is you get a sense that very slowly and painfully, for the reasons Dan in particular highlighted, those questions are elevating inside the leadership, maybe even to the Li Qiang level and so on, now that he has been given a little more room to run. And yet, the messaging coming out of these key meetings is always more of the same.
Guoguang, go ahead.
In addition to those points my colleagues wonderfully explained, I think two dilemmas actually Xi Jinping is faced to implement his actually this 15 5-year plan. So domestically, he's challenged by the dilemma of his control of elite, and so to give the elite space to do their jobs. So that's basically his control of them reduces their, the cadre's willingness to do experimentation in governance and development. So that's really, really big challenge. So even the plan, even the plan seems really good. So still, how to implement that, that's a big problem. In foreign relations, I think the dilemma is that Xi Jinping emphasized technology, progress, and so blah, blah, blah. But the problem is, so he is confrontational to the United States, and the technology actually cooperation with the United States is a major factor. Before Xi Jinping or until recently, that was a major factor contributing to China's economic growth and technological progress. So how to actively still engage China into so-called globalization when globalization declines global-wide, and when China still practice confrontational attitude with the United States, so Xi Jinping can achieve his actively goals in economic growth and economic technological progress. That's really big dilemma. Yeah.
Thanks, Guoguang. I think your point about implementation is so important. We'll still have to wait to get the full outline of the 5-year plan in March. But even after that, the proof will really be in the pudding of, what do the more detailed implementing plans issued by local governments, by central ministries, what do they look like? How does the implementation of these priorities actually pan out? And, within that implementation, there's room for inflection in, more serious or kind of less serious directions across different priorities. So it's kind of a constant wait and see. But I think, the conversation we've been having over the last hour and a bit has kind of, laid out the contours quite well, and they do kind of seem to be mostly focused on continuity. And a big driver of that picture that she is continuing to focus on is obviously the United States and the greater pressure that it and its allies and partners are placing on China's economic development. That was a remarkable kind of feature of the last plan, and Xi's explanation at the last plenum focused on that, kind of a much darker view of the world taking hold in Beijing after the first Trump administration. But we're now in the second Trump administration, and later today, Wednesday night US time and Thursday morning China time, we're going to get the first in-person meeting between Xi Jinping and Donald Trump since Trump returned to the White House in January. So I think we'll just focus on that for the last 10 minutes or so that we have. And maybe we can just do a kind of quick whip around the room and just get everyone's expectations for that meeting, and whether it's how much of an effect it's going to have on China's own trajectory. Like, is US-China relations something that is going to continue to dominate Xi's thinking, or is this self-reliance agenda, this outreach to the developing world, that's been a growing part of Chinese diplomacy in the last couple of years, does that mean that the US is actually becoming less relevant? I think it's a question worth asking. I have my own views, but let's kind of go around the room on that, and just anything you'd like to say about the meeting coming up, and especially what the fourth plenum does for setting Xi up for success or otherwise in South Korea today. So I don't know if anyone wants to jump in, but maybe we can go in the order we started. So that goes back to you, Dan, and then Michael and Chris and Guoguang.
So President Xi is a very serious man. I don't think he will walk into a room without knowing that there are concrete results ready. So I believe tariffs will be lower. They will get a deal eventually, if not later this year, maybe earlier next year. And I expect a deal. But as a Chinese, there is this general sentiment of degradation of the bilateral relations over the years. So in almost all Chinese business leaders and officials that I talked to before, everyone believes that long-term decoupling is inevitable. And I think that's an entrenched thought. And the fact that the 15th five-year plan is focusing so much on leading technology is the understanding that China can no longer rely on the US on tech. So if now the leaders are meeting, that means we're at this peak China-US relation, but it will go sour at some point. We don't know what will trigger it, but what will happen. But the Chinese knows that they wouldn't get a leader that's more friendly or likable than Trump. Trump is the one. So no one that I met in China like Rubio or Vance or any of the other possible Democratic candidates in the future. So there's a willingness for Chinese officials to invest in Trump. And I think this is like a rare window of opportunity before 2028. And a lot of good things can happen. But I think also similar to the first phase of the trade deal, China may not fulfill the whole deal, and some other things will happen.
Yeah, I think briefly, I'm a little surprised at how much progress they are making with this meeting. I thought that a lot of the stuff would just be teed up for Trump's visit to China early next year, but he's clearly swung into deal mode. So I agree. It seems like we'll get a commitment, if not the actual implementation, on tariff relief. China's already started to purchase soybeans. That seems clearly like it's part of the bargain as well here. I think I also view this as really a window of opportunity for Beijing just to have some stability while it pursues this agenda. I totally agree. I think decoupling or de-risking there's a strategic logic here that's going to be very difficult to break, and the two sides continue to be in a race to see who can reduce reliance on the other in the area of semiconductors on the Chinese side and rare earths on the US side, but it extends beyond that. So to me, the riskiest part of this in terms of what could go wrong, I mean, there's always an X factor, but I think I think the truce on supply chains is going to be difficult. I think Trump is going to be faced with some very difficult decisions in coming months about export controls, as given the centrality of AI and China's advances in chips and AI models, et cetera. So I think that's going to be the area to watch, although seems like we should have at least some stability ahead before Trump visits China early next year.
I think I agree with everything both Michael and Dan have said. I think, obviously we now know, because we knew already, but the Chinese have confirmed the meeting finally overnight, and they did what they always do, which is they didn't confirm it until right before the meeting, despite the fact that the U.S. did so a week before the meeting. So good on them, I suppose, for not allowing the U.S. to dictate their procedures to them. But my sense is it'll be a good meeting, right? And I agree with Michael. I've been surprised at the pivot, I guess you could say, by Trump toward deal making. It may be more robust package than we would have otherwise believed. And that's largely because if you're the Chinese, you're very much happy with what you're getting. I mean, I found it quite striking, the change in tone post the Malaysia talks between Secretary Bessent and Ambassador Greer and Li Feng, in that, you have Wang Yi in his call with Rubio sort of saying these guys are amazing leaders and they respect each other and so on. I mean, it could be confused for, the soliloquies that Trump cabinet members deliver in cabinet meetings. And likewise, People's Daily used its Zhongsheng, pseudonym to sort of talk about this. Unlike Trump, Chinese officialdom doesn't make positive vibe remarks unless they are anticipating a significant win, right? So I think that makes a lot of sense. Neil, I wanted to address also the question you raised about Xi's or China's perceptions of the relationship, because I think it's absolutely critical. I've been surprised at the continuing lingering in media accounts and so on of this idea that Xi Jinping is somehow pining for a state visit to the United States. That's not my impression at all. I think he's happy to undertake it if he's given the opportunity. There are a lot of risks in a state visit for him, especially with an unpredictable guy like President Trump in terms of what might be said, and so on. And I just don't think it matters to him as much anymore. If we look at the most recent Foreign Affairs Work Conference, right, in 2023, which is their most authoritative, meetings on how they're thinking about the international environment, they basically said, we're making a big play for the global South. That's our focus and intention. And U.S.-China is, of course, important. I guess I'd inject a little different note, maybe of some positivity to close us out than Dan, certainly, on the issue of, yes, I think China believes decoupling is the ultimate direction. I do think, though, that both leaders saw what rapid and full decoupling could look like in April, and they both said, I don't think so. So whilst decoupling is ultimately a trajectory, my guess is it's always going to be sort of soft decoupling, except in these areas where China feels for national security or self-sufficiency, like technology. They need to do their own thing. But I don't think either side is sort of saying, yeah, I kind of enjoyed having my economy seized. When you look over that precipice, it's not a good look. So maybe that's some optimism.
Yeah, very quickly. I think in general, Xi Jinping doesn't want to relax. To increase Sino-US connections, basically because of two considerations about security. First, the regime security, actually Xi Jinping always worries about Western influence in China, in Chinese society, in Chinese populations. So when, the scenario like what happened in 1990s and 2010s, 2000s, so those, connections did help China to be much more liberal than before. So Xi Jinping really worried about that. So that's basically he doesn't want to see, connection between China and the Western world, increased. The second is about his personal security in terms of power and the status. So he actually worries about, the re-emergence of the power business alliance within China, with China's political economy, and also across China's connection with other countries, particularly between China and the United States. But with these general principles, I think he knows actively you need to get benefit from your connection with the United States. So that's why when you can make deals, good for China, favoring China's interest, particularly economically and technologically, he would like to do that. So that's why I think, in forthcoming meeting between two presidents of China and the United States, in South Korea, so trade war, of course, would be somehow relaxed, at least temporarily. But I think that tension will continue actively for foreseeable future.
We are out of time. Guoguang, Chris, Michael, Dan, thank you for a fantastic discussion, and thank you to everyone who tuned in. And we look forward to seeing you at our next events. Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.
Thanks so much.